get started, I am very happy to welcome you all to the very first of the Braver Angels DC Alliance Speaker Committee's speaker series, which I believe now will be going by the title of the Solutions Exchange. Is that right, James?
To find out, I'm not coming email.
I'm excited and honored to invite you all, or to welcome you all to the very first of those events. Braver Angels DC Alliance does various things around Washington DC and holding holding panel events with various folks who do things on different issues relating to polarization is one of them moving forward. And I am excited to get this started here. So tonight, the theme of discussion is scaling Mount Polarization, a theme that I only belatedly realized is a wonderful, delightful pun. One of the questions with depolarization work is, can we scale it? And I just thought it was a question of trying to get to a higher level of knowledge of polarization. I only just realized that there's questions of expanding this work to more and more Americans inherent in the title. So Speakers Committee, good on you guys for being brilliant there. We're going to talk today about different approaches to divisions, discourse, dialogue, debate, other deep words that are relevant to the work of depolarization and the work of finding some aspects of common ground and some approaches to real divisions among the American people. And I am joined today by two people who have been thinking long and deep on those issues and many more on various fronts. So directly to my right is James Coan, who has been a consultant in various communications projects for quite some time, and he currently serves as the Blue Co-Chair of the Braver Angels DC Alliance and regional lead for the Mid-Atlantic region of Braver Angels' vast grassroots empire. So he does all kinds of good stuff, and I'm honored to join him here today. We are also joined by our old friend, Cheryl Graeve, who is the national organizer for the National Institute for Civil Discourse, and a real pillar of the bridge building and depolarization community here in the nation's capital. You two, thank you for joining us tonight. We will get started on all of this in just 1 second, and let me put a really brief framing question for both of you as we start. So anybody who hangs out in the bipartisan bridge building, civil discourse space in DC or elsewhere for long enough starts to realize that the thing that all of our organizations in this movement are doing, there might be some essential similarity and some essential common ground about the thing that we're doing, what that is. But many different organizations come with very different approaches to it, based on different theories of change, based on different understandings of what is helpful and what those divisions really, at the end of the day, are based in. There are a lot of different approaches to that. Some of those emphasize common ground, some of those emphasize reasonable disagreement, some of those emphasize productive policy work, others of those emphasize humility, inculcation, or stuff like that. There's a bunch of different things. Come up with some psychological, political theory of how people can overcome their divides, and there's some organization someplace doing it. And the one that we're going to focus like a laser on this evening is dialogue, debate, discourse, and what that means. And so I think at the onset of this, if you can just give a brief summation of how useful you think dialogue is to the work of helping Americans come across their divides, ways that you've experienced that in your own work, ways that you've observed that in other people's work. Just tell me what you think about dialogue, and we will move forward from there. James, would you like to go first?
Sure. All right. Well, thank you for joining us, and welcome. Hi. I guess, right, this is a benefit. I guess we can have a dialogue right here. If you have a question, we'll probably be able to answer it. So first of all, thank you, Luke, as my co-chair for the DC Alliance and moderating today. Thank you to Lindsay. So this is the soon to be renamed committee that puts these events on, and to Cheryl, thank you very much. Yeah, it's going to be intriguing, possibly disagreeing with you, because you're like one of the most agreeable people imaginable, and like the most warm-hearted person. But right, the idea of dialogue is not agreement all the time, so we're allowed to disagree. So in terms of how useful dialogue is, I think at a micro scale, it can be extremely useful, and I think it can be very effective. But I will say that my focus is on scaling, yes, that Mount Polarization. What can be done en masse? We are in a very large country, right? So thinking 335 or so million people, 155 million or so voted in the 2020 election. Big numbers. And the current approach to dialogue, I think, has a lot of difficulty scaling. We typically use workshops and or kind of facilitated small group discussions. And you're right, so engage this audience right off the bat. So I was just doing some mental math. So say we could have 100 events around the country per day, and we could impact 10 people in each of those events. How many years would it take to reach all 155 million Americans? Anyone want to try to do mental math?
105 million Americans who voted in the presidential.
Yes, yes. How long would it take to reach them? Roughly 400 years. So, yeah, I will answer this question for now and say, I think there has to be other approaches, and I have a lot of ideas on what these other approaches can be, some of which can include dialogue, but don't necessarily have to. And we'll play around with it as we go.
Okay, I will take that as a partial vote of less than full confidence in dialogue, and get back to your full thoughts on what might be preferable to it in just 1 second. But Cheryl, same question to you.
Yeah.
How useful do you think dialogue is to the task of depolarization at whatever scale?
Great. Well, and thank you guys for inviting me in. Pleased to be in good company here. Let me just tell you, before I answer that, a little bit about myself. I come into this work as a practitioner, and I think that supplements or helps lift some of the academic understanding of bridging and discourse and sort of discourse. I've got about 20 years or more in democracy building work, the national level with the League of Women Voters, did some student organizing in my day, and now I'm with the National Institute for Civil Discourse. And I think dialogue is essential and not sufficient. One of the things we found at the National Institute, really, the dialogue helps us ground our differing ideas. A healthy democracy is filled with juicy different ideas from people coming together and sorting it out and lifting the best of the possible. And when we have these divisions, we don't get that. Certainly one of the things we found at NICD, National Institute for Civil Discourse, is that when we'll go into this more, but when you pair dialogue with issues, that's when those two are a really potent combination together. People are attracted to an issue, they engage from their own experience and their own stories, we learn from each other as part of that, and people are kind of working together around solving a problem. So I think dialogue is essential, bridge builder. essential ingredient, but like say for example, when you bake bread, you know, it's not just the yeast. That's the only thing there that helps you rise. So how do we get this loaf to rise to the, you know, 150 million or 300 million of us? It's a really good question. And,
can you go into some greater detail on what the mix of dialogue plus issues looks like? Is that deliberative democracy? Is that issue endorsements? Is that possibly candidate endorsements? What does it look like?
Yeah, it's not candidate endorsements, no. It is one of the ways that one of our programs is called Common Sense American, and we take a process where it's directed at everyday Americans who engage around issues, and then that engagement goes to Congress. We actually start with Congress and talk with them about what issues are wise enough to attract bipartisan support, have a promise of passage, and then we put those out to our members. We're actually right in that process now, putting those out to our members. And then we put together the best of the sort of pros and cons of a particular slice of an issue. And then, people weigh in on that. And they weigh in not from a, astroturf motivated, moneyed kind of approach. But they weigh in, and they weigh in through an online electronic means, which goes to one of James's points about we need to scale big. So we can reach hundreds of thousands, right now we've got about 50,000 that are part of the certain network, and we really want that grown to millions, really. Because James is right, we need to reach that kind of scale. The dialogue component is something we've added where people are, once they're kind of imbued in an issue, they have a chance then to talk in small groups, again, on an online platform, so that can be scaled to many, but the intimacy of a group of 6 or 7 or so, and facilitator and conversation guide helps make those conversations meaningful, connected around the issue, offers a chance for people to hear different perspectives, and they come surprisingly with, we didn't have as much difference as I thought we would have, kind of thing, but anyway.
Is the intended outcome of the dialogue part of this, is the intended outcome specifically getting the policy over the finish line?
Yes.
Or is, okay.
Yeah.
So if the policy does not get over the finish line, it's not necessarily as complete of a task in depolarization as if it did. Am I thinking about that right?
I mean, that's a good question. I'm not sure that's the case.
Okay.
I think because we're working on bipartisan issues, there's an element within Congress which is reinforced in terms of working together. They get to hear from Americans, even if the bill doesn't pass. But right now, it's been 3 years. We're 3 for 3 on the issues that are chosen.
That's more than a lot of issue advocacy groups usually get.
Right. So, and I do think that comes from the fertile soil of understanding which issues offer bipartisan promise really seriously, and then the citizen voice involved. So members of Congress don't get to hear all the time from other than really passionate advocates, and we are in common sense. What kind of makes sense to people? I feel like I'm talking too much.
No. I was trying to get you to talk too much. So that was your full exposition of all this. So, do you have any last thoughts on that before we go back to yours?
Yeah, I think we're, like I said, we're in the process of selecting an issue now, and the span is great, and then we go back to our members because bipartisan promise in Congress, interest and bipartisan interest among everyday Americans. That's another key element, and then those voices getting into Congress and saying, hey, expect you to do your job. We expect you to listen to the best of the experts on this and to engage with us. So
I will have further questions, but let's go back now to James. James, Cheryl just shared various dynamics and understandings of the NICD approach to dialogue. do you think that not what do you think about the dynamics she mentioned, but what do you think are the dynamics that you would emphasize in the insufficiency of dialogue and the preferability of other things?
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, I guess I will, well, first of all, Mike, it's great to have you in terms of coming up with the idea of scaling Mount Polarization. We very much enjoyed this, so thank you for that. One of many contributions, but that one in particular right now. Another co-chair of the committee. I think in terms of information environment, what messages do we hear, do we see, right? Like, there's a reason there's an industry of advertising, right? Like, people can be influenced. I mean, there's also propagandists, if you're talking about politics. And, you know, propaganda can be interpreted in many different ways, mostly negative, but, you know, in terms of convincing people of some kind of political topic or feeling, yeah, that matters. And I say right now, we have an overwhelming amount of negative kind of messages that we hear about the other side. But I'm not gonna say, oh, the messages are bad. I don't necessarily believe in a moral suasion argument, like there's all these bad people who are saying bad messages. I think the incentives are wrong. And so I will talk about the incentives for voting, you know, for electoral systems, social media, and news media going forward. Don't have to cover it all here. But I think also, you know, and I think that's an area that we can address, which the depolarization movement hasn't really gone in that direction, right? This isn't really dialogue. We can discuss how to address it, but that's not really the point of it, right? It's to change something. Some of which can involve policy. You know, some of it could be very bipartisan legislation. Others may not be. I think in many cases it is bipartisan legislation, but it's legislation to change incentives that are distorting this information environment that kind of surrounds us. But then I think there's also a lot of messages that we can create that do improve the information environment, right? That can bring us together, you know, terms like social cohesion or whatever, depolarization, right? So if we think, you know, right now, lots of divisive messages, not many messages that can bring us together, and my goal, essentially, is to change the balance. No. So that's pretty much what I'm going to talk about. How do we tamp this down? How do we bring this up?
Would you like to start with legacy media?
Okay, so legacy media. That is one that, okay, so that is a tamp down. I do not think a lot of public policy makes sense there. I mean, sure, we can have lots of discussion about the fairness doctrine and should that come back. I mean, okay, you put an incredibly right-wing person, an incredibly left-wing person, it's 50-50, and they're just gonna scream at each other, and I don't know if that does much. So I don't think there's a whole lot of public policy there. Maybe some support for local journalism. I'm mostly interested in the incentives. And so, in general, it's also true with social media, right? How do these, mostly companies, get money? But even a nonprofit has to also get viewers or listeners. And right, they do things that emotionally arouse, get people energized. It could be positive, it could be surprise, it could be delight. But often what's best is anger and activating identity. And humans tend to have a negativity bias. So if you're a reasonable, you know, firm that wants to, you know, have profit, like not go bankrupt, you know, you follow what are people going to do who are going to click. And then if people click, you get advertising dollars. So that is the incentive structure. And so then the question becomes, how do you change this incentive structure? And so it's not the easiest thing in the world, but I come from the world of energy, and there has been quite a change. I mean, arguably the biggest driver of changes to climate change right now is Wall Street. Sounds kind of wild, but right, they're changing incentives. If you want to drill, we might not give you all that much money. We're afraid that you're going to have stranded assets, and like, we're actually really concerned. And so the stocks are vastly undervalued because big pension funds just don't want to hold a lot of stocks. I mean, it's a huge sea change in like the underlying incentives. I mean, that might be a fairly liberal example, but right, there can be incentive change. In this case, it's probably like convincing advertisers to not support certain entities. And then the question becomes, how do you rate these entities? How do you convince or out the advertisers in this entire world of digital ads to make it work? And it's not easy, but I would say that there is some possibility. There's a site called Ad Fontes Media, and it rates kind of news programs and organizations in terms of left-right dynamics, and then like that's essentially the degree to which they have follow facts. That's a very fraught word, but and so they kind of bucket it into 3 levels: like green, yellow, orange, red. And in theory, entities that are maybe in orange and red, there could be another entity that says, don't give, cut them off, right? They are not helping society. That's also challenging. There tends to be, unfortunately, more on the right that would fall into those categories. There is a group called Check My Ads Institute that is trying to do something like this. It is extraordinarily liberal. I mean, it is basically on a vendetta against all kind of conservative media. I'm not saying that, so right, I mean, I think what Check My Ads Institute is doing is theoretically right. I don't like exactly their approach because it's extremely one-sided, but in theory, another entity could be like that and target advertising but not be so one-sided about it.
As I have heard said, the writing of the rules determines what can and will be done. And so the process of writing the fundamental rules for any particular sector of society is one of the spots where the fundamental incentives are decided. And so tell me, James, if I'm understanding you more or less right on this. But I'm understanding that you believe that much of the problem of polarization in America is basically an amplification problem from a couple of key sectors of society that are currently incentivized to super amplify polarization. And most of us ordinary Americans, most of us elitist Americans, whatever, hear things, and that becomes the social information environment that we live in, and we get more polarized because of it, and we treat each other badly because of it. And if you can change what goes into our ears and goes into our eyes at a systematic and structural level, you can reduce the amount of polarization by reducing the amount of information, or changing the type of information that goes into our ears and eyes, and then manipulate our behavior to be less polarizing people by that. Am I more or less understanding that right?
Yes, yeah, I mean, I don't know if I want to use the word manipulate, but yes, messages matter, right? I mean, maybe we'd hope that, right, someone can be surrounded by all sorts of messages and they never have any impact, and people are Teflon, and they just bounce off of people for years on end and they have no impact. But I don't think that's how any psychology says things work. So yes, although I would say, I have 3 kind of big buckets. So one is news media. I mean, there's an argument that, like kind of the Cronkite era is this very unusual historical anomaly where advertisers wanted to appeal to many people. This is in Ezra Klein's book, Why We Polarized. I guess probably others have made the argument. So it's a long history of yellow journalism, essentially, right? A long history of kind of two sides or multiple sides fighting it out. But at least we could make it less bad. social media falls into that category also, right? Where the idea is to get people's attention, to get eyeballs, to get advertisers, and there's no guardrails, really. I mean, that's where I think public policy could have a role, and I'm happy to talk about actual public policy options there. But the third one doesn't exactly follow that, or doesn't really follow it at all. I mean, we have an electoral system that we never tell a developing country to adopt our electoral system, because usually it leads to ruin. And so that's not really an incentive thing, that's more of a structural issue. But we can get into what kind of structural changes there are. The weird thing to pique your interest is I want to copy Australia. I think Australia provides a pretty interesting example of what can be done and has been done for 100 years. And there's a lot of things that would be attractive to both Democrats and Republicans about them. So 2 for 3, 2 out of 3, yes on incentives and 1 on electoral systems.
Cheryl, James mentioned some things that go closer to questions of fundamental policy here, and I'm wondering what you think about some of the things James said.
Yeah, despite the fact that we, are scaling Mount Polarization, we were maybe going to disagree. I actually agree with a fair amount of what James has said. Having said that, I do think looking at policy in terms of how it may affect polarization, there are places that there are particular pieces of legislation that could do that if they were to pass. And some of the reforms into our sort of electoral system, I think would be helpful. So, things like maybe ranked choice voting, or systems that don't put so much energy and emphasis on the primary, because that's where the polarized ends just execute their voices so loudly. And then we, everyday Americans, kind of get, we get the hardest part of the ends there. I do think there are policy possibilities, but for example, unfortunately in this particular Congress, it is really not a snowball's chance that something like this would get passed, but there's the bridging, oh, I'm gonna get it wrong.
Was this
Bridging civic, building civic bridges.
The modernization committee, right?
Yeah. One of the things that kind of comes out of that, one of the things that comes out of, comes out of some of the sort of democracy groups that say we need more of an investment in civic education in this country from beginning. We need structures. We have the National Institute for, we have the National Democratic Institute and the National Republican, RNI, Republican Institute, that go overseas and sort of help other countries build democracy, but we don't have that here. So, some of the components of this particular piece of legislation may help us shift the focus of where resources go to help us really rebuild democracy. And I frankly think that there's a huge public hunger for that, despite what we read in the traditional media, what we're led to believe, that we are so divided. We are polarized along the social needs that we need. That has been built, I think, in part with help through the egregious engines of incentivized, as James said, by division and eyeballs and fear and the kind of things that move we human beings more quickly, more vigorously than do things like love or common ground, or so I think I am curious about really how we do change some of those incentives, to be quite frank. I think so I'm interested in check out a couple of things that you mentioned, because we are just incentivizing the behavior of division. And so how do we incentivize? What kind of things are built into also accountability and transparency in the social media arena? What kind of incentives are changed so that they actually make money when they provide fact-based information that helps us see and engage differences constructively rather than eyeballs? And and I will say, I know that some of the things I think and I ponder are could be put into some utopian vision. But I will tell you also, having been from the League of Women Voters, where women worked for more than 75 years to get the right to vote, and that was impossible when they started, right? So these ideas, and as you were mentioning, James, the incentive for sort of maybe the energy industry to move towards more renewable sources because maybe it's in their, maybe it's business interest of theirs. That's the kind of thing I think we need to do with our information systems.
James, Cheryl, do both of you, or rather do each of you individually, and I'll put this question to each of you in turn, do each of you individually think that the vast majority of Americans, and whether that's a 60% majority or a 99% majority or whatever, do each of you think that the vast majority of Americans tend to, number one, have more in common than they have not in common, and number two, have political and policy-centric common ground more so than not? And number three, do you think that said common ground from said supermajorities of Americans could be attained were it not for the pernicious effects of incentives and institutions and ideologies in dividing that? I'm asking both of you in turn, do you agree with each of those three statements I said? And does that inform your general understanding of this? And I'm both genuinely curious on both of your cases, and I will also use your answers to push us into the next part of the conversation. So James, let's start with you on that. And I'm serious when I say that supermajority can be anywhere from like 60% to like 99%. So.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so, I mean, okay, yes and three, okay. Yeah, there's a lot of academic research. I don't know, it depends how we're defining what percentage of people for what. I don't exactly know which numerator, which denominator for what, but there's a lot of work showing that there are misperceptions, overly negative misperceptions. When I think about, when someone thinks, oh, people who vote differently, people who identify in another political party, right, they are seen as more different as people, like demographically, things about them, their policy views are just seen as more different, and it's seen as they think worse about us than what is actually the case. I feel like the jargon is meta perception. And so, yes, this is a setup. I mean, like, I believe this is the biggest kind of, when I'm talking about the different messages, tamping down, bringing up, I think this is the most important part of the bringing up messages, that we have more in common than we think. This is kind of generally basic psychology. You want to bring people together, you talk about what they share. There's other ways to do it, but that's by far the most direct. And so, in general, I love acronyms, mnemonics. Yeah, so it's like cut to the chase, right? CUT, right? Show that people have more in common. Show that people on the other side are not just some stereotypes; they're unique individuals, and show that we can be friends and work together, right? So commonality, uniqueness, togetherness, cut, and you write the idea of messaging. Come up with a few messages, and you just start repeating again and again and again. I guess the third question gets into political dynamics. So the voting systems that I mentioned, so what does Australia do that's fairly interesting? Yes, there's ranked choice voting, but I would say ranked choice voting in the US has been kind of labeled a democratic policy. Maybe it can grow from there, but it's tricky. Australia has that, but it also has proportional representation. And so proportional representation, when done well, with maybe 4 to 6 parties, and there's some scholars who say that, and I don't know if there's a magic number, then it can allow for both competition, so politicians want to win elections, but also the potential for a lot of cooperation. And the US kind of had a 4-party system, right? There used to be Southern Democrats and Northern liberal Republicans, and that kind of, that's dissipated.
I think it's coming back, but okay.
In very small parts of DC, perhaps. And, well, maybe talk about it later. Yes, so then when the political dynamics are basically appeal to the base and demonize the other side, yes, there can be certain policies that are supported by a lot of people that don't actually make it to become law, but also there's a lot of misperceptions about what other people think. So even if you think that one thinks, oh, I believe this, but they think that other people don't believe it, then that's not going to help either. So getting these perceptions to be more close to being accurate, that there is more in common than we think, I think would be very helpful. And there's a lot of research that shows that this can be done relatively without that much effort, with that much time. And there can be quite a few benefits of people just recognizing, like, okay, well, maybe I don't have to beat the person up or break all these democratic norms because they're actually not that scary, because they're more like us. And that's really the idea behind it.
Yes, and yes. But I do want to build a little bit on the perception gap idea. I think if you're interested, there's a group called More in Common that they've done a report, and some of you may have read that. But for example, the idea, I think one of their stats is that overall Democrats and Republicans imagine almost twice as much that their political opponents, if you will, are considered extreme. And really, as they measure it, it's more like about 30%. But we all have to say, oh, not half of it, more than that, almost 55%. So I think one of the things that we've seen that's effective is, and here's where actually dialogue does help play a role in getting people to listen to story, to find commonality, and to understand that we're not as different on issues, especially as we're led to believe. So we found that very effective in some of our small group conversations, that you can decrease the perception gap. And one of the things that I think there's some studies being done now too, and so we would like, at the National Institute, we would like to explore more what kind of processes we have that may help elevate in a larger, visible, more media savvy way, the idea that to bring people's perceptions closer to reality. So, yeah.
Can I ask a question?
We'll go to questions in just about 5 minutes. There's 2 last parts here, but I will come to questions in just a second. So we are getting pretty close to Q&A time, but I appreciate you guys going through on all this. But I wanted to go to the last little bit, which is, I'm glad that you two both agreed with all 3 of those statements that I said. The reason why I asked them is because I personally do not agree with any of those 3 statements myself.
Interesting.
And I think it seems more and more to me like whatever common grounds do arise between Americans and I at particular times, they tend to be on a shifting basis rather than a sustained basis. They rise on some things rise on other things and might break down on other things. I don't see super majorities rising up in ways that can last. And even if there were super majorities that do rise up in ways that can last, they usually seem to be premised on some kind of like soak the 1% or destroy the technocrats or marginalize this group of elitists who are making things bad for everybody, that may well fit inside some of the populist traditions in democracy, but also seems to have a little bit of a dehumanizing flair to them. And so I have always been skeptical of consensus majoritarianism on those two bases. Number one, that it seems that America actually is incredibly diverse on things that matter, namely pro-life, pro-choice. There's still a lot of sexuality and gender and transgender things that a lot of Americans have very strong disagreements with people in our networks around here on. Frankly, unfortunately, it seems that there are even race questions that we have not moved into the right levels of common ground on, and beyond just the hot button cultural things, at the level of policy, at the level of what exactly should the US federal government be doing to mobilize certain parts of American society for certain national ends, I don't know that I really see a full agreement on what those national ends should be, particularly on questions of energy, particularly on questions of what the US role in the world should look like. And so I say all this to say that it seems to me that there actually is a profound amount of uncommon ground, as much as there is any common ground. And I guess I'm skeptical of the things that, while being fundamentally friendly too, but I'm skeptical of common ground as being the only basis for depolarization work, because it seems to me that if common ground is the thing that is required for depolarization work, there's it has no answer to what happens when one side walks out of the union. And so I say that to say, before we get to Q&A, I'm just going to throw this as a last question. If there weren't the amounts of common ground that you are hoping for and that you believe do exist, would your systems still work? Would your systems still be able to build common ground where there is less common ground? Or is there a alternative approach that you would be looking to at that point?
You know, I think, let me take a quick stab at part of this, because I think one of the distinctions I'd like to make is the difference between common ground and the ability to create a common understanding or agreement. We talk about it at NICD, we talk about it as engaging our differences productively, which means, yes, there's all sorts of different ideas that come from different life experiences, and that when you bring those together in a way that people can understand, and they're given some choice and some pro-con, and they get a reasonable opportunity to explore that together, when they want solution, they go there. I mean, there is so much, that is where the common ground is. I would not say it's like a monolith in any way, shape, or form. And in fact, a democracy does not thrive if there's just sort of a monolithic approach to policy problem solving. That's the beauty of a real, genuine, engaged democracy, I think. So I guess I want to make that distinction in sort of what you said. And honestly, when we bring people together in a safe construct where they're able to not be attacked because they have a different life experience, or something better comes out of that than went into it. So I guess I'll make a little distinction there.
James, same question.
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, I think there are lots of differences. I mean, it's up to us to define what the definition of profound differences are. But if the differences are profound, the perceptions of differences are doubly profound. And so, right, that the data that you had from More in Common, you can look at there's another organization called Beyond Conflict that did something. So yeah, let's say on immigration, right? If you look at kind of like from completely open borders obviously no immigration. You know, and you look at Democrats and Republicans, it kind of looks like this. I mean, you know, there's some overlap, but there's quite profound differences. But then you ask people, what do the other people, what do the other side think? And the graph looks like that. So, I mean, yes, it's profound, but it's much more profound, the misperceptions. And so that's what I'm just trying to get to the accuracy, which, yeah, I mean, and views change all the time, right? Again, messages matter. It's not like this is a world of stasis where, like, you know, people are just like fixed forever in a certain thing. And I would say, so say commonality were ripped out. I mean, again, I love things to remember stuff by. So I have two so's and two how's in terms of like the building up kinds of messages. So this is the first one. It's essentially so what, right? This is, you know, getting into the what are actually more in common. But then you have so sorry, and so, you know, okay, I don't know exactly who's here, but I am a college-educated coastal Democrat. And there are lots of people who fit into that category who can be quite condescending toward people who don't fit into those categories. And that is counterproductive, and that's bigotry. And so saying, don't do that, that's not helpful. And, you know, maybe be a little sorry, or you can figure out exactly what the right word is, but that can be a message that comes out that doesn't really have to do with content. Then there's the two hows. So one is how long, right? We have a sense of like binge drinking, right? Like, I mean, technically it's 5 drinks for a man, 4 drinks for a woman in a 2-hour period. But, you know, so there are rules, or but we don't have a sense of like what binge scrolling is. We don't have a sense of what binge watching news is, binge reading news. I mean, even if it's good news, there's a lot of divisive topics that get written about because it's more interesting. If it bleeds, it leads. Okay, cool. But so if you're bleeding stuff for hours a day, it's probably going to have a pretty bad effect. But we have no guidelines whatsoever as to, like, you know, maybe an hour is enough. You know, go out and play. You know, like, right? It's good to be informed, but eventually you're just going to probably get depressed and, you know, anxious. It's not going to be that effective. And then finally, how to. So this is where we end with the dialogue, okay? All right, so I start by saying dialogue, it can be good, but it's hard to scale. So how do you scale dialogue? And my argument is through messaging. And so, all right, Cheryl is with Cheryl, so she knows. It's to be civil. It's not a speech impediment, it's civil. SVL. So again, I love my mnemonics. So what is civil? So this comes from Rob Willer. He's a professor at Stanford. And he did a 30-minute podcast. I was running around and I was listening to it. And I'm like, cool, I can do this in 10 seconds. It's share your story, relate to their values, and listen. So share your stories, relate to your values, listen. Stories, values, listen, be civil. It doesn't cover everything, right? I mean, I could call myself a B- depolarizer, right? 80-20 rule. So if you get most of the way there with a lot of less effort, I'll choose that over, you know, A+, perfect, you know, multi-hour kind of conversations. And so that's a message that doesn't require commonality and encourage people to be civil.
Well, James, when you get your massive apparatus for the propagation of depolarizing propaganda for all Americans at all times, 24/7 setup, I will hope that the first message that plays on it till the end of time is the one thing that gives us all complete unilateral common ground. Cheryl is the coolest. And I will look forward to those days. Let's go to some questions. Sir, in the back, you had a question here.
Thank you.
Yes.
I was curious for Cheryl to expand, and Jim, you may have just done that, when you said that the perceptions of one group over the other are magnified by 2, I think was that it. So I think Jim actually clarified it for me what they were saying, that if you are on a different view than me, I view you as twice as much of a monster as you are.
Yeah, or twice as many of them are that different than really are. Yeah, something like that.
I appreciate that clarification too, as well. Too. I am only half as much of a monster as I see it. So, further questions? Yes, Anchor.
James, you said that you believe dialogue can be scaled through messaging. What does that look like? Can you tell me a little bit more about what that looks like?
Well, I mean, essentially, you know, if one's going to have a conversation, what should people keep in mind? So I relate this to stop, drop, and roll, right? Like, right? Just what is the simple thing you just got to repeat in your mind over and over again? Okay, so if I have this difficult conversation, I guess I'm going to just tell a lot of stories about myself and not like debate facts. I'm going to try to figure out what do they care about and try to relate to that. We could talk about it. It comes from Jonathan Haidt has these moral frameworks, and liberals they have 2 or 3, conservatives have 5 or 6, and you're trying to relate to those. And then listen. I guess if you're having a conversation, good to actually communicate with the other person rather than shouting talking points at them. So I mean, it's just basically something to keep in mind in order to do it. It doesn't give all the guidelines, but if we're going to choose 3, you got a professor who's kind of top in his field who says it, and then I can simplify it into something that people can plausibly remember, and it can be repeated a lot of times.
Further questions, thoughts, or comments? Yes.
So how is that a message, though? That's a dialogue, that's a communication, but what's your message?
Well,
like if you're gonna message, it's kind of one way.
But it's a message of how to dialogue, right? Again, I said the most important messages to me are the so what, are the commonality messages. But I do think that there are these 4 different kinds of messages that can be done. The commonality messages, the kind of, don't condescend, the binge watch, limits to time, and then finally, how to dialogue. So those are the 4 kind of big buckets of messaging that I think can work. But I would say of those 4, the most important, I think, is the first one, is the commonality set of messages.
So point it out,
Well, so
like send a message that says, I get you, or I feel the same way.
so you mean how you operationalize? So if you hear,
I'm
I want to tell a story.
okay, now what?
So sure.
You say so what? I'm like, yeah, so what? What do you say?
So in terms of the dialogue messages, or
Just I'm just going on what you said, messaging, okay? So what's the commonality message? I know that you want, all those lousy, rotten Hispanic people who are trying to get in. I mean, is that what you say?
No. Okay.
I know that's not what you said.
Wait. Okay. Maybe we can talk after. I'm not entirely sure if I'm getting this. I mean, the values liberals tend to care.
Just so the audience online knows, nobody's saying anything bad about Hispanic people. This is purely
I'm just kidding.
question.
Because I want to answer your question. I'm just not quite sure. Care and fairness are tend to be liberal values, and there's authority, liberty, loyalty, sanctity that are more conservative. And so you just try to relate statements to those values that make sense. So if you're talking about the environment, to a conservative, you might talk about the purity of nature, which would be more like a sanctity type argument rather than being a care argument, which would be a tree hugger type argument. So those are the kinds of things, and obviously that takes another level to get there. I don't know if I've all answered your question.
As I try and distinguish any differences between what the 2 of you are saying, one of the challenges that you started with was this idea of scaling, and trying to I am interested in Braver Angels because it helps me to talk to my brother one-to-one, or even my whole family. But I thought that you were saying messaging and incentivizing on a bigger scale, which has to do with how do we get companies, you're like, how did Wall Street get where they are now? You know, was that from their research department, or because they paid attention to something, or, you know, and they're not paying attention to the lobbyist who has a totally self-interested agenda in their communication or their messaging.
Obviously, you have activists who have strategies that can be effective, and eventually, in that case, central bankers started saying this is a risk, and so you need to account for this, just like you account for risk with insurance and lots of other kinds of risks. In this case, yes, I generally think about all sorts of what we might call influencers in society, and what those influencers consider, you know, religious leaders, entertainers, athletes, politicians, public health officials. I mean, you know,
well, that's what I'm thinking of too.
Then what kinds of messages do they say that are easily digestible, that can be effective? And then there's another question of what do people say to each other, which you can't entirely control, but if they're digestible messages that can be repeatable, then some people, because messages matter, will probably start saying those messages. Like cable news, right? The top cable news shows in the country get like 3 million views a night, right? It's not a big part of the country that actually watches them, but right, their messages disseminate in all sorts of ways through social media, and people tell their friends, and so you get these kind of influence channels that are quite impactful.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm getting at, is like, how do we influence social media, even a cable news. You know, I wanted to start my own cable news channel.
Well, I mean, yeah, there's always the fun of like Unity News Network or something. It's always possible, but again, my thing is about incentives. It's not like, oh, you know, MSNBC, please be better. Oh, Facebook, please be better. It's change their financial incentives, and then they'll change.
Sure.
That's hard, but I think that's the approach.
Yeah, I'd love to dig into more what that kind of incentive really looks like, what it means, you know, when we walk with our feet or our eyeballs to something else.
And how we can appeal to other people to do
Right.
the same thing, even if they're like-minded people.
Right.
And assuming that, you know, maybe there's, when it comes to, like, I think an issue, or not an issue, but an area of life where there's a lot of opportunity to speak to people is when we talk about our children. You know, not everybody has children, but a whole lot of people have children. And that's why these, you know, these school shootings have a lot more potency, I think, depending on how we talk about them, how they get reported in the news, how the guy shows up at the microphone, what he says, or how he's speaking, what things he's pointing out.
I think you guys should plan on having a conversation after we close out.
And, you know, and there's a couple of places I'll just point you to find some maybe language and words at work, thinking about maybe your brother. Pace, and in fact, I can send you guys a link and maybe you can send it on to folks. But this, let's see, PACE is like philanthropy, civic, I can't even remember what the acronym stands for, but it's basically a group of foundation funders that wanted to explore what kind of language works, what kind of language is most affiliative, most resonant with different populations broadly across Americans. And so they've done some research and study into some of the words that matter, that may land with us best, that may be kind of the way to reach out to people. And this doesn't get to the incentive, but it does get to, if we, to James' point, if we do start talking and understanding that certain ways that we approach social media, certain ways that we ask our elected leaders to show up, you know, there's all sorts of mechanisms for this, but we as people, I just know both the power of everyday Americans working together, moving towards places that we want to be, rather than places that the narrative would have us believe that we're in.
Let's go to a final question from the gentleman in the picture in the front.
Thanks. I'm Doug Addison. I'm from a little teeny tiny nonprofit called Center for Free, Fair, and Accountable Democracy and Civics for Adults who either didn't learn or forgot what they learned. But I wanted to come to your question of scale, and I want to put my question to everybody, actually.
That's, for the sake of time, I prefer the question to be directed to these two, but everybody else can take it as a question.
Oh, great, great, yeah. So trying to think about scaling and trying to marry together some of these ideas, and I'm thinking in particular about the tension between incentives, mostly being profit, and learning by doing, which is, I think, a way to encapsulate what NCID does. Here's the idea. How many people would be attracted to, say, a magazine or a TV show that is modeled on hobbyist magazines? Like there's all kinds of magazines about gardening, how to grow the best tomatoes, how to grow the best cucumbers, how to fix your car, right? Suppose that we change that to how to solve problems. Okay, for example, in California, California, a couple of years back, they brokered a deal between environmentalists and lawyers.
This is in the form of a question, please.
So, but it was like, how did they do it? And that could be an exciting story. So it marries together profit and learning by doing, and it's scalable if enough people would go for it. So my question is, do you feel like this is something customers would want to buy?
Final question of you.
So this reminds me a lot of the Solutions Journalism Network. I don't quite know if you're familiar with it or you're. So I mean, it started roughly 20 years ago in the New York Times, where a couple of journalists said, news tends to be depressing. It says problem. Well, why don't we focus on, solutions, on ways to how we can fix it? And so now there's a quite robust solutions journalism network. Of that, probably the most famous person who relates to this space is Amanda Ripley. And so it is a viable movement. I mean, there are solutions. There's something called How Do We Fix It? It's a podcast that often has people in this space speaking. So, I mean, I think it is done, but movements often do have their own publications. So that's where I thought you were initially going. Like the NAACP had or I guess it still has, the Crisis, right? So that was like their publication, and in theory, Depolarization could have its own publication. There was once an editor of some publication.
I still have, actually, if you want to submit a piece.
Yeah, no, I mean, I do think there can be a market for it, and I think we can become more sophisticated in understanding, like marketers are, the human instinct, what resonates, what moves people in the positive way. And I think there's a Bridging Movement Alignment Council, which is right now working also on sort of messaging about bridging and connecting and engaging differences productively, which is important. We are different. We have differences. It's important to engage those. And I think to your point about sort of what are some common places, community. Most people want to live in a safe, good community. Most people want their families to thrive. So there are some common themes, I think, that can sort of resonate. And then I think there's some questions. I mean, Monica Guzman, she's got this great book and talk about inquiry and curiosity and really having those kind of questions or messages be part of what what we may do in dialogue, how we might do that on a massive scale of communications, but I do think there has to be some overhaul of the way, the mass communication works, and so I am also more curious to dig into what would be those incentives really that would move.
The last thing I'll say, a pitch, is that at some time during the year, we'll have what journalists can do to kind of, right, this is a solutions exchange, supposedly the new name of this, so that'll be one of the potential solutions, and I think we'll try to get someone from this Solutions Journalism Network.
Well, the hour being late and our final, yes.
One more thing,
Yes.
I just wanna, one of the things I always want.
By the way, I'm not gonna enjoy it. I'm gonna give you guys the last statement too. So,
All
I'll
right.
keep going.
All right. I just want to encourage everybody who's here, all of our work, it's really important right now. And so I always would like people to leave with some kind of opportunity for action. So, don't just take whatever you heard, and if there was anything juicy or good that you liked that moved you, but take it and apply it to your networks. Get outside, of your network. There are opportunities like National Week of Conversation is coming up, November 17th through the 22nd. So there's going to be hundreds of groups that are doing, Brave Angels are doing all sorts of other groups are doing things. If you go to conversations.us or citizenconnect.us, you can find like hundreds of events that you can engage in. And the way that is, those conversation events or training events are being elevated by a whole group of people who want the media to pay attention. So op-eds will be done, and interviews will be done. So those are the kind of things that I think also lead to what James is encouraging, that we take advantage of the mass media operations and showing the story.
The hour being late and our final questioner having helped us find the final key by which we might solve polarization, the hobbyist magazine of depolarization. We're going to call to order in just a minute here, but first I want to give Cheryl and James about a minute or so each to give any last thoughts and any last pitches on things at the end.
So I'm happily employed as an energy consultant. Right? This is a hobby for me. It might be a career at some point, but right now it's a hobby. The only way that it makes sense for me to continue and for me to consider this to be a career, the statement, go big or go home. So if you want to go big, talk to me. I don't know. Right? I'm not the scary panelist. I don't know. I want to talk to people and figure out how to go big effectively.
And I guess maybe I did my last pitch by don't just leave it in the room here. But I also, one of the things that I love kind of about dialogue is that there is tremendous wisdom in groups. There can be tremendous challenges too, but there's tremendous wisdom. And so I not only appreciate being here, but I love and I can tell that there's some really good minds in the room who are thinking about some of these things. And so thank you for whatever you'll take out of here and make it not just be a conversation.
Thank you to both for being here. Thank you for this conversation. Hold on, don't clap.
Don't clap. Why?
Yes, because I still have my announcements to make. So
You have to
the
clap for
Braver Angels DC, I wouldn't clap for them either. The Braver Angels DC Alliance is committed to holding various events open to the public all around Washington DC and the surrounding area, several times a month for the foreseeable future, hopefully forever. This was one of the panel speaker events that we'll be doing pretty frequently here. We also do a whole huge variety of workshop events. We also are doing the Braver Angels debate series once a month, and we are also going to be getting back into a series of other sorts of events, including some closed door conversations that people have been requesting us to do. So there are many ways to get involved. There are many ways to get active. I think the next social we're doing is April 20th, right, or April 19th?
April 20th.
April 20th. Thank you. Appreciate it. So we have a whole bunch of events coming up in the month of April. I don't have the majority of them off the top of my head right now, but if you're interested in those, please come up to James and myself later after we adjourn this. And I apologize for doing an atrocious job of running this panel, but I appreciate James and Cheryl doing a great job.
Come on, now we gotta clap for this.
We will see future Grave Angels again here in DC, and thank you for coming out this evening. We'll see you all soon.